welcome to testing your Alfresco add-ons. I think we'll just start and see how this goes. Just a few things. We'll probably go over introduction, who are we, what we're going to talk about, some of the automation tools that we use, the best practices that we've learned over the years, setting up the project with Maven, and finally a demo that pulls all of this together into a practical, viewable term. I'm Michael Suzuki. I'm an engineer with Alfresco for some 3 years now. I've been working on the benchmark team and been behind the SharePO project, which we'll talk a bit more about. Will?
Hello everyone, so my name is Will Abson, so I'm the lead of the Share Extras project, and I've also been in Alfresco engineering now for about 2 years. So I've got more experience on the UI side of things, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
So why testing makes sense? Why do we do testing? Well, it gives us confidence that the system is behaving as it should. What we do, validate that there's no regression, pins the functionality down, and one of the key things about it for me that's very important, it helps us find problems early. And that early feedback that we get from finding that something went wrong is vital. And finally, testing is basically very good at detecting differences. That's what it does, and at its core. Now, there are different types of tests. Just show of hands if anyone thinks there's a perfect test. Well, the answer is no, because if you had a perfect test, you would write just one test. But we have mechanism to deal with that. We have different tests to deal with different scenarios. So you have a unit test, integration test, and functional test. The following diagram is something that I like using. It's by Mike Cohen, and kind of gives you everything I was going to explain in one image. And it's having this diagram represents a good balance in a company, your testing and how it's set up. So as you can see, you have a unit test. You can have many. It's easier to automate, and the axes kind of display that. And I find this a very nice and accurate way of describing all the tests put together and how they sit. And at the very top, you see the cloud thing. Some changed up with an I, and that represents the human aspect of it. There will always be some amount of manual testing, and that's inevitable. I'm going to pass it over now to Will to go over the unit testing.
Okay, thanks Michael. So you've seen the different types of tests there on that previous slide. I think that's a really good diagram because you can see the different types of tests and the different numbers of tests that you have there. So as a developer, well, where do you start really? Well, most developers tend to start at the bottom there and then build up. So you start off with your unit tests. And a unit test, the definition of a unit test is that it's testing, obviously, a unit of code. And a unit of code is just something that can be tested in isolation by itself without any external dependencies. So I want to talk a little bit about unit testing and how you can accomplish that in a modern system like Alfresco with the complex UI that it has. So it hasn't been easy until now. What it is fairly easy to do, and what developers have done who've written third-party extensions, is you can write unit tests fairly easily against your repository component. But these days, we have a much more complex UI. We have Share. We have a new framework on Share. And that's led to developers shifting a lot of the logic in that application onto the UI layer. So it's important that not only can we test any repository Java code or other such code that we have running in there, but we also need to be able to unit test at the API layer. And this has been very hard until now because, as I just said, in order to unit something, you need to isolate it from the other components. So you need to isolate it from the repository, for instance, and just test it by itself. Now, we have a new framework in Share called Aikau, and I'm not claiming any of the credit here. This has been it's been put together by Dave Draper and a few other of the engineers in the UI team. I don't actually see any of them here right now because I think they're giving another talk on this very subject right now. So I'm sorry you're missing that, but I gather all the sessions are recorded, so I definitely recommend maybe listening to that back again afterwards. So the framework is called Aikau, and it's based on this AMD concept, and it allows you to implement these standard units of code in client-side JavaScript and JSON, which are known as widgets, and they can run on top of Share. Now, the testing components, we're actually sucking in a number of other open source projects in order to accomplish that. So we're using Grunt, we're using Intern to do the testing. Grunt is really just like a runner for doing things. You build up scripts, so like you might with Ant or Maven in the Java world. Grunt really does everything in the JavaScript world. I mentioned these widgets are JavaScript based. So Node and NPM, Node Package Manager, are also very important in this mix. So we've pulled in this technology in order to give you this unit testing framework for your UI widgets. Okay, so how does it actually work? So you've got Intern, which provides the framework for taking your test data and throwing it at the widget that's under test. The actual test data, you've got that test data statically defined, and what the test data does is it builds up a page model containing your widgets, just containing your widgets. So you're isolating that from other parts of the page. And that is static, as I mentioned. And then there is a web script. A standalone web script doesn't require authentication or anything like that. And the test framework can take the JSON model, construct that, and throw the test data at it. And that can all happen just within Share. So the idea is that it's only Share that you're requiring. We don't have any other external dependencies here. Now, as well as I mentioned decoupling in the sense of separating things out from the repository, but we also need to separate widgets out from the other UI components that they're interacting with. So we use a pub sub mechanism to drive widgets and to capture behaviors within tests. Now, pub sub is used, or should be used, by developers writing widgets because it allows you to maintain that separation between, say, a button and a bit of application logic, which then gets run to perform some business logic, and perhaps that loads some data from a third-party service and injects that into the DOM. But crucially, what you're doing is you're separating out these different widgets using this pub sub model, which is rather like a message bus. It's very similar to that, although that's more of an old school term. Pub sub, much more fashionable, much newer, basically the same thing. So developers use the pub sub framework, and it allows us to isolate our widget during testing. We also have a special logging widget which you can use in combination with your widget that's under test in order to ensure that stuff that gets published to the pub sub log is correct. So tests can use that to ensure that the correct data is being populated onto there. As I said, I also mentioned that we need to run the repository separately, so this framework is designed to operate just within Share. And it's possible to load up Share, run those tests via Grunt, and we don't need the repository sitting there in the background either. Now, when we run our tests, one of the key concerns for developers is making sure that code coverage, there's a good level of code coverage. So I previously worked on the Salesforce integration project. I talked about that at Summit last year. And interesting statistic, if you're an application developer in the Salesforce ecosystem, you must have 70% unit test coverage of your application. If you do not have that level, then you cannot publish your application as an add-on for Salesforce. So that was quite eye-opening to me. We all want to have good code coverage, but we don't always. But it's something that you need to keep track of within your project, and we use this code coverage node plugin to accomplish that. There's also some grunt tasks which are used to produce that coverage report. Now, once we've got our tests, we need to run those. Now, I think this is the nicest thing about the Aikau testing framework. There's different ways of running these tests. So, as a developer, when you're writing these tests, you want to you want to be quite interactive there. You want to be able to run them really, really quickly, so you can iterate on the test itself. So, the way you would run that there is to use a local Selenium instance. And that would start up a web browser for you and drive that directly using whatever web browser is on your system there, Firefox, Chrome, whatever. Now, when we're developing, what we do is we also have a Vagrant VM. So that gives us a consistent Linux-based environment between all the different developers who, of course, use different OSs. And we can run that continuously in the background as you're developing new functionality, and that allows you to catch the regressions. So obviously that's one of the main reasons of testing that Michael mentioned up front. Having this run continuously in the background rather than having to be called explicitly by the developer allows you to catch those bugs literally as you're typing. So we use a Vagrant VM for that, and of course, once you scale up your testing, you probably want to test across a range of different web browsers. And to do that, you need to look at a grid. So you could have an internal Selenium grid, for instance, or you could use an external grid like Source Labs to essentially outsource the web browsers there. So the tests are compatible with that. So hopefully that's a quick introduction. I realise there's a lot more information on Aikau, on the testing side especially as well. It's really just a quick overview. The first talk there that's on the slide is the one that's going on right now, so you can catch up on that after Summit. There's also a talk that Kevin Dorr is doing tomorrow. It's more an applied example, looking at UI generation with Share, so that might also be of interest. And also there's a blog post there by Dave Draper, who's the lead author of Aikau and the testing framework. So definitely recommend checking out those resources.
So we've touched upon Selenium, and that's one of the tools that we use. And what we're going to look at is how we use Selenium and essentially what is WebDriver. WebDriver, those of us who are new to it, it's an open source API, supports different languages, different OS, and it allows us to interact with the browser. And here's a snippet of how you would start a WebDriver and go to an Alfresco page. Then once you're on the page, this is the second stage, which is you want to find these elements on the page. And you have the following strategies which you can use. My preference is always ID, name, CSS selector, and last XPath. They all have different attributes about them that makes them good with certain things and less performant with other things. So XPath is very heavy. It will take up a lot of your resource trying to find elements in the DOMs. So we try to avoid that. But there are things about XPath that it trumps everything, which is you can use regex with XPath. So just ideas you can use when you're using these strategies. And how would you find these strategies? Here's, again, sample code where you'd find by ID, names, and so forth. Now, the final part is once you find these elements, what do you do with it? So you can do quite a few things, and just list the most common things that we tend to do is check if it's displayed, send input keys to it, and click on it. So this is kind of the ecosystem of using WebDriver. Now, over the years, we've came up with some best practices that we've learned and helped us a lot. And those are the page object pattern and the render pattern. Page object pattern, simply put, is if you see a page, imagine that as an object and encapsulate all of that page in the object. There's a quote from Martin Fowler that probably worded a lot nicer than I would say, but has a lot of potential with it. And what it does is it separates the code from the testing. And in here you see it's a sample diagram of Alfresco share, and it supports inheritance. So we can structure it and reuse code. So very recommended. And here we have a sample code of the login page that we saw earlier. And as you can see, rather than seeing this copied across every test, you just call this object and use the methods in this object to drive it. And reiterate what I said, page objects will encourage reuse of the code. You won't have cut and paste everywhere in your tests. Makes tests more readable. Tests' sole function is to assert things. You don't want to see more than that. And those of you who might not know much about JavaScript or about how the page works, you can encapsulate that in that page object. And finally, it's easier to maintain. The render pattern is something that we've coined in Alfresco. I don't know how many of us here have been working with Selenium and WebDriver over the years, but the common problem we tend to find is the intermittent failing test, and that's to do with timing issues. So most people tend to put thread sleep, which is something that we don't support and we don't encourage people to do. What we've came up with, which was a solution that really worked for us and now been around for 3 years, is the render pattern. And simply put, what we do is every page object implements a render pattern, which is the logic to just determine if the page is ready for you to use. What it is, for instance, the login page, we're only interested in 3 things: the input field for username, password, and the submit button. So once we have all these fields, we know we're ready to use the page. So the render pattern then determines that and says, okay, please use it. Otherwise, it will go in a loop as we see here. And implementing a logic like that to determine if the page you're looking at is ready saves you a lot of time and headache and resolving intermittent failing tests. And so far, with Alfresco, it is a very complex site with AJAX calls happening. So we've been using this extensively to determine, is it ready to use? Because something is always happening. So what we have is, I don't know if those of you who've come across the SharePO project, it's basically a library of the page objects and all the best practices that we've done over the years put into this library for everyone to use. And I've been heavily involved in it, and we still have a lot of work to do, but what we're trying to do is map all the pages you see in Alfresco Share into a page object for anyone to reuse and do testing and assert and validate that they didn't break anything and everything's behaving as accordingly. WebDrone is basically our wrapper for the WebDriver with added goodies. It's basically a WebDriver on steroids. So all that comes in, and things to avoid: WebDriver code and test code and vice versa. We don't want to see test code and WebDriver and assertions and page objects. We just like having a clean separation of the two, and thread sleep. And just to give you an idea, we had about 950 tests running on one module, and some people wrote thread sleep here and there. Some put 1 second, put 4 seconds. Essentially, our tests run on average about a good 3 hours as a result of these things. And to go and fix and remove them, you can imagine, is not an easy task. So the page objects and the render have helped greatly maintaining it. So we're going to do a bit of a small demo, and what we're going to use is the latest Alfresco SDK Maven tool. And before we do, these are some of the things that we recommend, since yesterday from the hackathon, a lot more new things came in, so I probably would suggest to change your memory size for your Maven options to 4 gigs, or if you have more, because it does a lot more things now. But what we're going to do is we're going to create an archetype, call from an archetype, create an Alfresco amp and a share amp, and do the hello world. Whoops. So I was going to say, can anyone see that? That's better. So what we have here is an empty directory, nothing in it. We're just going to generate these archetypes. I'm calling it from my local repository because I wasn't sure if we had internet. And I'm going to choose option 2. I don't know if you can see the writing, but option 2 is an Alfresco amp. Let's call it org summit demo. Call it Alfresco amp because I get very confused easily, so naming stuff like that's better. Now we're going to create one for share. So share is option 3, org summit demo. And call it share amp. That way I know which one I'm working on. So I'm old-fashioned. I tend to do a lot from command line. So I'm just going to set up the Eclipse parameters from the command line. One is for Alfresco, and the other side will be for share. So now what we've done is basically created all the profiles so Eclipse can pick up these projects. It should work on IntelliJ, but it won't work on my machine because I don't have IntelliJ. And as you can see, it's imported the project. And what's cool about this is it allows you to do hot code reloading. What I'm going to do now is just launch it as a background process. We'll do here as well. Amp to war, and that basically deploys it. Now, what we have here is your standard Maven structure with a new additional folder called integration. We broke the convention a bit. Usually you have your source and your tests, but we have added an integration to clearly separate it. Because on one hand, you don't want to run your functional tests every time you do Maven clean install. So we've kind of separated for ease of use. And if you're really interested in running the whole suite, you have 2 options. You have the functional profile, or you do Maven install amp to war -p functional, and that will test your functional code in your integration folder. As we can see here, we have a page object for the demo page, and your demo test, which will go to the hello world page and see the message and validate the title and message is there. So waiting for Alfresco to fire up. In the meantime, I'll show you some of the other things we have, which are, these are all standard out of the box. Those of you who've used Maven, it's the same thing, only we've added integration. We have a demo class here to just show you, it generates a message based on what you put in, put out. And the demo component is your bean that binds it everything together. So we have 2 types of tests, the unit test and integration test, and the functional test, which I think we're ready to do. Now, we'll start with the functional test, and we can run it from here, or we can run it from Maven, but for now, I'll just run it from here, as we're running low on time. So you can see at the bottom, there's some red things, some typical messages coming about what the browser's doing, and we should see a Firefox coming up and going to the page and testing it. And what we're using here, again, is pure WebDriver, because this is just Alfresco. On the share amp stuff, we actually bring in the share PO stuff. Oh, sorry, I ran the wrong project. I ran the share amp first, sorry. So what we're seeing here is basically the hello world that we've written for the demo. And we're asserting that the message is displayed and the logo is there. And the final thing we've done there is also test that it still works by reusing some of the page objects that came with the Maven library. So the Share AMP project here comes with the Share PO library with it, so you can access all the library pages that we've created. And finally, it also has an option to do a regression test. So what we're offering is, unlike many companies, we're offering all our test suites. So if you want to regression test everything, it's all there. I do warn you, it will take 3 hours. Use it wisely. But you can change the parameters to say, what we tend to do is we use testng, so everything is configurable and it's declared in an XML file. So if you want to run a different type of functional test to just validate, you can just change it to testng, and all of it's open source, so you can see it and run with it. Now, the other cool thing about this hot code reloading, you can actually make changes on the fly. So let's say we want to change it to welcome to Summit. And in true fashion, I'll just put a debug point so you can see that this is happening live. And we'll just run. So hopefully, doing proper TDD, we should see this go red, because obviously we haven't changed the code on the front end. So we would say welcome to demo amp instead of Summit, and this would go red. I'll put a debug pointer so you can see, stop and pause it, because otherwise sometimes it goes too quickly. And just shows you when you're developing, when writing tests. What's going on here? Oh, sorry. I've been shutting and stopping this test too many times. Let me just refresh the project. Refresh and refresh. And now I'll know where it is. Yeah, I've been doing this over and over and over, so Eclipse gets a bit confused. So we've seen it fail. Have we? Oh. Well, did I mention I'm colorblind? So I tend to struggle with red and green. That should have failed. Let's make it fail. Let's just see what's going on here. Wow. Welcome Summit. Where's that? Show in Package Explorer. That's an Alfresco amp. Well, all I can say is it did work, but the demo gods have failed me. I need to sacrifice a laptop or someone. Maybe if I do it from the command line, I don't know if it makes any difference. Yes, I'm sure this is amusing for everyone, but oh my goodness, this is stressful. I'm hoping that what we're going to do here is just give you a taste of how you would write it on a command line. Hopefully it will fail. But I do apologize. We've done quite a bit of work on the hackathon yesterday, so everything's a bit transient. But what we would have seen is the test failing, we go fix it, and then it would go green after we fix what's in the front end. That's more like it. That's the welcome demo amp. So that passed, and that showed us a different page. So I suspect something's wrong with my Eclipse. And just gonna start with a new one here. Where's my integration? There we go. Let's try to run this one first time. Run as. You might have noticed we tend to use testng for our functional tests and separate JUnit stuff with testng. And at the time, it was just a decision when we started writing this. Testng was giving us more flexibility with what we can do versus JUnit. So we can see that this is the test code we've seen run a couple of times. I'm sure you're bored about it, but repetition apparently I hear is good because it means you remember it. And yes, here we go. Hello from IA18. That looks like the right class, the right message we want to see. Oh, typical, my laptop decides to die. Okay, so we're in the right test now. I do apologize for earlier. So, hello from Summit. Exclamation mark, and we'll run that. So, we'll just put a debug point here so I know it's the right thing, right place. Fingers crossed. So, we're seeing the grid start up, and what we tend to do is we have, my goodness, it's just not happening today. Well, in the meantime, if anyone has some questions, by all means, feel free to ask, and we'll answer every question while I try to fix this.
That was actually a failure of sorts.
Yes. It is a failure of sorts. Was that a question or a remark? So while we're waiting for share to come up again, and I'll run the test again, just to show you how easy it is to run a test. So that now we see is red. I can say that it failed. So what we're going to do is go and fix it. And remind me, where do we keep all that? Hello from Summit. Now, this will work. This will go green. It would be mean if I just said we're out of time, thank you very much. But now I'm very, very adamant and convinced that this will go. Maybe. The only shame about what I've done now is that we're not demonstrating how we can change the code without restarting Alfresco and share, which is the beauty of the new Maven stuff, where you can just change the code on the fly and everything will pick up. And running the tests immediately after will just give you that validation that everything is behaving as, hey, hello from Summit, it worked. So I've done it the old-fashioned way, where I've changed the code first and then changed the test. So that should go green. Yes, it has. So we're happy it's working now. Just to give you an idea, it's still running. So hello from Summit. Sorry about running the test too many times. So if we go to that page now, we should see it fail. And because the new message is me groveling for making you see that test over and over and over again. But yes, that's the gist of it. So if anyone have any questions, by all means, we have loads of the SDK members here as well. We have testing team. So if you don't get to ask all the questions you want, we're always around. So by all means, please do. So just go. There's a debug point. Yeah. By the way, the hot code reloading thing is not working anymore. So that'll be fixed for by the end of play today.
No questions about hot code reloading then, please. Any other questions? Or any questions?
Hot code reloading is not working because you're changing your properties file and not a new file.
Thank you. Ole, always there to put me. So, what was the question? That was the answer. So the answer, the answer is these are property files. So property files it won't load, do hot code reloading, and that's a very good point. And Oleg was instrumental in having this demo for us today. Basically, I ripped his sample code, so he would know. Any?
Is the WebDrone project open source?
Yes, everything's open source and available for anyone to look, take down, and use it.
So, I mean, the tests, you have separate tests for enterprise and community?
Yes, we do. And basically what we tend to do is have test.ng to say which version we have. So you might have some annotations in the test. You'll see that enterprise only or 4.2 or so forth.
Oh, so all in together?
Most of them are in together. Exactly.
How easy is it to publish the JavaScript code coverage to something like Sonar?
So we do use Sonar. We use that for our main JUnit testing and the coverage of that. I don't think we have a bridge there. So at the moment that's separate. So that'd be a really good question for the developers who wrote that actually. But no, at the moment it gets published as static HTML. So it is not integrated with Sonar at the moment.
Well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,